So this will be the second core lecture of dynamic field theory, and this is sort of toward higher cognition. And I'll jump right into it. And now I don't really need to remind you extensively what we did yesterday. I do this not to lead up to a certain point. So I think by now you're very familiar with this notion of neural dynamics, a differential equation where all the inputs are contributions to the rate of change on the right-hand side. Only the sigmoided activation patterns are transmitted, contribute to coupling, interaction, and so on. And then we look at neural dynamics of this kind for fields, activation fields, which are defined by their connectivity, either from a sensory surface, ultimately, maybe through multiple stages, or from the field down to motor surfaces. And you just in the exercises, you looked at these various instabilities that make detection decisions, initiate actions, initiate thoughts. Later, we'll see a critical for initiating thought. We'll see that today. And they are capable of selecting here, for instance, selecting one of two choices. And they do that in a stable way, that is, even as the sensory information or the neural information about these choices varies in time, they will stabilize the selection decision until destabilized by instability. It can be smooth, seamlessly being integrated in working memory, and so showed you how categories emerge from that. Now, all of this is based on the interaction within the fields, right? The local excitatory and global inhibitory interaction that makes the peaks, and that makes the instabilities, that creates these dynamic regimes, the regularity. So that's a very special kind of connectivity that, I mean, it's very commonly invoked because there is a lot of neural evidence for things like that. Local inhibition, global excitation. Local excitation, global inhibition is a general theme. You will see that in many places. But still, compared to conventional neural networks, it's a very particular kind of connectivity described, for instance, in the models by kernels. And that means that these it has a way fewer parameters, right? There's some regularity. The kernels are the same connectivity pattern applies throughout the field, and it always has this range of excitatory and maybe also the same strength of excitatory coupling and then of inhibitory coupling. So if you think of individual neurons sampling the field, then among all the possible connectivity patterns, this is a very special kind of pattern that is much lower dimensional in parameter space. So so we're really postulating that this is an important principle of cognition, that in the brain, it is using things like that. And the next two lectures will be very much about illustrating that, what kind of work that does for you. It has one important consequence, which is that, so we call these things localist representation. And I will address this issue of localist at the end of today's lecture and tomorrow again. And one implication is that this form of organization of interaction really only works in low dimensional spaces. So far, all the spaces were just one dimensional for the illustration. And I'll now show you, 2, 3, 4 dimensions, but not 10,000 dimensions. And I will be looking at that later in today's lecture. I'll actually make some kind of estimate of what it would mean to scale this up. See, the alternative picture would be to think of every neuron as spanning a dimension. If you had activation as a variable that spans a axis of a space. So if you, for instance, were to think of the neurons as rate coding something through their activation level, they represent, let's say, intensity or some other variable. Then if you had 10,000 neurons, that would be a 10,000 dimensional space. And that kind of picture is actually being used in some neural network models, including spiky neural network models. And then people talk about dynamics in such a sense. And that's not how we're talking about it. We're talking about these continuous feature dimensions spanning the space. And the neurons are just sampling that space, but the neurons are very constrained in their dynamics, so we don't think of them as independent degrees of freedom because they are so strongly bound into these peaks. The peaks are really what represent something, right? These peaks of activation here, for instance, for perceptual representation, right? Motion would be described by a few parameters like horizontal position, vertical position, motion direction. And just plotting two of those, a localized peak of activation is then the neural representation of one object moving, like this object moving in a particular direction would be represented by a peak in 3 dimensions, 2 of which are plotted here. Or a movement. Among all the possible movements, one movement would be represented by one peak over appropriate movement parameters. So it's these representations by peaks of activation, that's special. And it's these dimensions that we count, right? It's how many, that span the possible percepts or that span the possible movements. And so our thought would be, or our claim is that the source of things that we represent in this way are actually low-dimensional things. So you're representing, like, for instance, an object in terms of some feature values, maybe its color, its orientation, its velocity, speed, movement direction, and so on. And I will be looking at actually how to even organize even a handful of dimensions like that, and not as a very high-dimensional, complex visual image. For instance, if you sample the image with retinal neurons, then you could say, well, a priori, every neuron is a different dimension. Every neuron could have any value. And then a little patch of net retina would already be like, 10,000 dimensions. And if you take the input from a camera, for instance, for every pixel in the camera, you get a variable. And so naturally, that's actually a matrix that has this sort of order of magnitude, actually going into 100,000 independent, a priori independent variables. So we're not talking about that. We're essentially saying that that is not what is being represented in the brain. And I'll provide a couple of arguments for that as we go along. So that's important distinction from maybe more conventional neural network thinking. So I mention all this because now I will be looking at high-dimensional fields. I will be going from 1-dimensional to 2 and 3. I didn't have an animation of that, 3-dimensional fields. And we'll be looking at what that buys us and what happens when we do that. So first simple answer is there is nothing special happening as we increase the number of dimensions moderately with the dynamics. So you can have the same instabilities in 2 dimensions and in 3 dimensions and in 4 dimensions, for instance. So there is it's not like the mathematics as such is different. You will sometimes find statements like that in the literature of mathematical neuroscience, or some branch that people call that neurofield theory. And it's true in the sense that there are some special solutions. For instance, there are ring-like solutions in 2D, and there can be sphere-like, or there can also be bulb-like, so symmetric pairs of bulbs in 3D. Somewhat exotic solutions where you have to have special symmetry properties of the inputs to bring that about. So that's not what we're talking about. These solutions, could be relevant maybe under some circumstances, but that's not, so far there is no evidence for anything like that playing a role. So in the first approximation, as you increase the number of dimensions moderately, and even it could be increased a lot more, I'll have other arguments, for instance, the number of neurons in the brain, to argue that it doesn't scale to very high dimensional spaces. So the dynamics as such is not really changed. What we'll be looking at is maybe what the meaning, what are these different dimensions about, and that's what we'll be looking at. Before we go there, I wanted to point out one special case. So if I talk about 1, 2, and 3-dimensional, we actually sometimes talk about 0-dimensional fields. It's a bit loose way of talking. So these are individual nodes, and that's actually the picture we used initially in yesterday's lecture to bring, to come into the whole discussion of neural dynamics. Now, to call these 0-dimensional is a bit misleading. Again, neurally, they would be small populations of neurons. It wouldn't be an individual neuron, right? A small population of neurons that are excitatory coupled. And in many of the cases in which we invoke such neural nodes, we think of them as embedded in larger populations so that they compete with all the other neurons outside the little bubble. So it's actually more reasonable to think of those as also being embedded in a field, but the field is not, there is no real metrics to the field. There's either you belong to the local cluster or you don't, and that local cluster would be modeled by a node. And we can't really say exactly how many dimensions that is. And that is really quite important in our path toward higher cognition, in that that's a form of representing categorical things. So objects or concepts and so on that are not that do not invoke continuous feature spaces, but that are categorical, like the meaning of a word, and the word blue, for instance, or the concept of blue would be represented by a small population, and it would represent that concept of blue by virtue of its connectivity to a appropriate feature space that is connected to that. So for instance, if you have somewhere a feature representation of hue, different colors, and there is a synaptic pattern of connectivity, so that activity in certain regions of that space excite this population, and when that population is excited, it will actually for instance, pre-activate this region so that a peak can be induced in this region. Then you would say this node stands for this kind of peak, or enables this kind of peak. And we'll see that that actually is how we do organized visual search, for instance, for objects of certain color. And we will call these then concept representations, and we will say that the contents of this concept here, simple color concept, will be grounded by the connection to fields that are fed by sensory inputs, or that are ultimately able to be acted out, for instance, to the motor surface. That will be elaborated as we go along. And again, there's nothing special about the dynamics of these nodes. As you saw, the nodes have the detection stability. If you have multiple of these nodes that compete, they have selection capacities. It is this the embedding into this picture now of what they represent by virtue of their inputs that is important. We use nodes also in a little bit more abstract way sometimes. I wrote here specific coupling structure, and you'll see some examples of that. And that would be a case where the nodes do not necessarily stand for a particular range of values in some feature space, but where they stand for certain operational modes. For instance, a concrete mathematical thing that we do is this boosting business that we looked at, but you also looked at in the exercises, where you bring a field closer to detection or further. That is a function that could be mediated by a node. You might have a node that projects to the entire field, and it's like homogeneous input to the field and activates the whole field or suppresses the whole field. And in given our instabilities, that can make that field becomes part of the architecture because it gets close enough to threshold to actually generate peaks. Or if it's inhibitory, or if you don't boost it, it might be taken out of the architecture, because now, even if it has inputs, it's not able to reach detection stability. So these boost nodes often have play a role of what in other models is called gating, where you would selectively activate or deactivate a sub-architecture of a larger architecture. We'll see examples of that. So nodes show up in different contexts in different ways. So this would be the more field-like use of nodes, and this would be a more also functionally specific way. We call this behavioral organization, or sort of process organization. And you'll see a couple of examples like that. That will be a topic tomorrow when we look at such processes of organization of sequences. Good. So that's just to say we can have dynamics. So this actually is the first example of connecting nodes of different dimensions, right? And neural fields of different dimensions, like a node with a field. And so in what we'll be doing now, here's the roadmap. We'll be looking at what happens now if we combine different dimensions in a higher dimensional field, dimensions typically that have different contents, for instance, combined color and space. That will be an example I'll be using a lot. And we'll see that new qualities arise from the combination of such different kinds of dimensions. I'll look in some depth into binding, I'll explain what that is, search, specifically visual search, and so on, but it can be used in a more general sense, and coordinate transforms, what comes. Okay. So to first talk about how different dimensions are combined, let's think about what examples of dimensions that we might encounter in the brain in psychophysical evidence. So, excuse me. So we already encountered, of course, fields that were defined over spatial dimensions through retinal space. And we just looked at one dimensions, but typically would be two-dimensional. And similarly, you could, I argue, you could, for instance, use spatial properties of addition for spatial localization, then the auditory space would be a similarly two-dimensional space elevation, and the lateral position could be represented in that way. And we already referred to sensory feature spaces, for instance, visual features like local orientation, motion, texture, color, scale, size of objects. Those are known feature channels in the sense that in the brain there are neurons tuned to such things, and we know from psychophysical evidence that these are properties of visual objects that, for instance, people are able to keep in working memory. Show someone an object, and after some time you show them two possible objects, and they can say which one they had just seen, and they are then sensitive to these kind of feature dimensions and not actually to the detailed image. You will not actually be able to keep in working memory the detailed image. And you can test it by people being blind to certain changes in the image if they didn't actually selectively attend to a particular feature. And very similar truths about other sensory modalities. In particular, we know about auditory features like pitch and formants, which are important in speech perception. They are sort of changes of pitch in a small interval of time. And we can talk about haptic features and there's subtle stuff about proprioception I don't want to go into. And on the motor side, there are analogous feature dimensions. For instance, these movement parameters are in a sense feature dimensions. For instance, movements are often characterized by the direction in space that you will be moving your hand, maybe the amplitude of your movement, the direction in which you exert force against some resistance, for instance. Something like speed or movement time would be a parameter. Interestingly, the kind of parameters that we find represented in the brain, or we find tuning, and that we have plausible arguments physically that they are represented independent of the movement itself. That is, that you can, for instance, make a plan, prepare a movement, are always in something like end effector space or hand space, which is interesting because it's very close to the visual space, right? You represent where your hand is, and you can also see your hand. And there's a notion that that's not by chance. There's a connection between how you represent actions and how you represent objects, that you represent them in a shared space, which isn't trivial if you think that you're actually making the movement by activating your muscles. And those muscles are, a lot of muscles, like 40 muscles or 36, 38, articulate your arm, including in the shoulder blade. And at some point, of course, you are driving the muscles, for instance, from the spinal cord and descending signals from the brain. But it seems like in the brain, what we're representing about movements is more about the hand in space. And that's, again, a low-dimensional space of possible movement parameters. Yeah, maybe I don't go more deeply into that. I could talk about that forever. And so there's also a notion of low-dimensional representation of possible actions in this way. And finally, there could be feature spaces that are even more abstract. And one example that we'll be studying tomorrow is ordinal position. So you can think of the order in which you do certain actions, you have certain thoughts, or you represent certain visual images as something like spanning a space. Is actually categorical in nature, but there are neighborhood relationships and there's metrics that go further away or closer. The number line is a concept like that. There's an idea that you have an actual brain representation of magnitude, so that larger things are represented, let's say, further along a certain one-dimensional space than smaller things, and that could be and there could be an ordinal quality to that or a metric quality to that. And there are two different number representations. So we'll get at one of those spaces a little later on. So this is a prequel for you to have concrete ideas about that. So this is, again, feature-based representation of, when I say object, it always means something that is localized in some sense. We're using localized peaks of activation, and it's localized in an actual physical space from which the sensory information comes, but also in feature space. As contrasted, let's say, to the notion of an image as a high-dimensional object, where an image is described by every detail, right? And this is a compressed representation that is physically plausible because the objects in the world are actually not, do not typically have arbitrary shape, and we're not sensitive to that. I mean, arbitrary contents. So, for instance, if you take an old TV, some of you might never have seen this, when you had a TV that has an antenna and the antenna wasn't tuned right, then you see these black and white patterns that sort of fluctuate in time. And in some mathematical sense, the different patterns that you get where the black and white is distributed in different ways are optimally orthogonal to each other. If you multiply them, you will in a matrix multiplication, you would very generally find the zero, but they all look the same to us, right? Well, if you compare different faces, for instance, these faces would be in image sense very correlate, right? There's always a certain structure right next to the nose and so on. But we're very sensitive to find differences between those. So the notion that perceptual representations would be characterized by much less information than is potentially in the image is an old idea, is psychophysically plausible. And similar things can be said about movement. So we're actually not doing movements like robots do, where you can just make any arbitrary strange movements. We make very regular kinds of movement. They can be characterized by a few movement parameters, and therefore they don't really require the full description, for instance, at any time course, like a polynomial of arbitrary order, any time scale course that would be thinkable for your arm to perform, because you don't do movements like that. And it would be interesting to think like that about the cognitive features. Okay, that's the background. Now, in the brain, we know that some of these features are represented jointly by neurons that are tuned to multiple values like that. So the most elementary would be Hubel and Wiesel's original work on visual cortex, where they found that neurons only fire when a light stimulus element of visual contrast falls into a certain region of the retina. This would be this outline here, the dashed line. Only light that falls into that drives that cell. Here you see some spikes generated by that cell from extracellular recording. And these cells, for instance, would be also very sensitive to the orientation of a light bar and its movement orthogonal to its orientation. So, for instance, here you see systematic variation of that movement direction, and you find this cell only fires when the orientation is here in this particular direction. So if you vary the orientation of the bar and the movement direction, then you would find that the firing of that cell makes this very nice tuning curve, right? And so if you take into account that there is a receptive field, which means there's a spatial location, and there is this dependence on the direction and orientation of the moving bar, then you would say these neurons encode both. They combine visual space and orientation. And this sort of dependence of neurons firing on multiple dimensions is something we call here, that's just our particular jargon, anatomical binding. Usually people just say, well, that means that the neurons have complex tuning. They depend on multiple parameters, multi-dimensional receptive fields. It's anatomical binding in the sense that for every combination of retinal location and orientation, you have a neuron in a sense, right? They have to sample that space. And we do find that there are essentially something like cortical maps. Some of you might be familiar with these orientation maps, where you go across the cortical surface and you see that the preferred orientation, where the maximum here of this tuning curve lies, then varies continuously across the cortical surface until there is a jump and then another continuous variation and so on. So that's anatomical binding. So if you have anatomical binding, you can still work with that, unbind and rebind and so on, and illustrating this here. So here I'm postulating that there would be anatomical binding between spatial location on the retina and color. In actual physiology, we know that color is represented by this opponency principle with the three kinds of opponency contrasts, which are more complicated. And so in our work, we were very often just talking about hue and a one-dimensional field for color. And so that's a shortcut, a simplification of what is actually physiologically the case, which is a bit more complicated to analyze. It's actually also based on the principle of population representation. And in the book chapter 3, this is explained, but in these sections, I just glossed over that. So I'm only using one dimension along visual space to make these plots two-dimensional, but in our typical models, this would be a very typical example of a three-dimensional representation where one dimension would be this feature, color, and the other two dimensions would be retinal space, x, y. Depth, the distance from the eye is typically considered a feature value because you have to extract it, for instance, from stereo vision or from some other mechanism of depth perception. So it's the space, the actual sensory surface space in vision is typically thought of as two-dimensional, same for auditory. And in some interesting sense, it's actually also true about movement parameters because we're actually making piecewise planar movement. So you're planning the movement of the hand within a plane. Interesting property. And the brain, of course, has two-dimensional structures. So the anatomical binding amounts to saying that if I have a visual scene that varies along these two dimensions or has different colors in different locations, then there's a direct projection onto this population that samples these two parameters. So every combination of color and spatial orientation is represented by some neurons. And so that this input to this field will generate peaks at the location, let's say blue to the right and green to the left. So these peaks would come out by virtue of the forward projection from a retina that has these color sensitive cells. And of course, here, for instance, in some of our examples from a camera that has these hue values and location on the sensory surface. Now, given that you have that, you can extract the bound information by projecting to low dimensional representation. So you have this two-dimensional representation. You could now have a representation of what colors are in the scene by just summing activation, suprathreshold activation here along the horizontal, or you could take the softmax or some other ways to do that, and would then find out that there is something green and something blue in the scene. If this was a probability distribution, we would call this marginalization, right? This probability distribution would depend on two things, two dimensions, and then by integrating, summing out along one dimension, you're marginalizing that dimension and just looking at the remaining dimension. Similarly, you could marginalize colors by summing along this axis, and then you would just know that these two locations play a role. So you can always extract from a high dimensional representation the low dimensional contents by marginalizing about the dimension that you want to get rid of. You can also conversely bind previously unbound information. So if you don't have direct information from the visual array, then, but there is something blue and there is something at this location, you could combine these two by making each of these fields excite in the reverse of marginalization, excite every possible spatial value where this color is represented, or every possible color value where the spatial location is represented, called the ridge input, right? That is the inversion of marginalization. And if you do that and arrange things right, then a peak might only form where these two ridges intersect, because you would have doubled the level of input here. So if you arrange the resting levels to be right and the strength of these inputs to be right, the field could induce a localized peak, this sustained self-excited peak here at the intersection of these two, and therefore you would now have bound the color and the spatial location. Of course, only because you have a substrate for that, that is a field that can represent bound spaces by having this joint tuning. If you assemble representation, you will later see why you would want to do that. For instance, you might have, well, we'll see. We'll later see cases in which you want to do that, where you not get the information directly from an image. But we point out that if you do that, you have already what was known in the literature as the binding problem. The binding problem is, in a sense, that this unbound representations are ambiguous, right? You know, there are two spatial locations involved and there are two colors involved, but you don't know which is what, where. So as you see, if you put these two inputs as rich inputs, there are four possible locations where these objects could be, and they would represent, you know, the different possible matches where the green could be at this location or at that location. So binding previously unbound types of feature information doesn't work when you do that for multiple objects at a time. So an object is not an abstract idea of a certain combination of feature values, and what you essentially have to do is to do it one at a time. You cannot bind multiple at a time. And that is actually our hypothesis, which is not original. I mean, a lot of people have argued about this in the past. This is just a neural implementation of that previous discourse, that the fact that this might happen in some neural processes, that you might be binding previously unbound feature representation, that leads to a bottleneck of doing certain operations sequentially. And you will see later when we talk about coordinate transform how that concretely may be coming about. So that is, I would say, mainstream sort of psychology with a neural story being told about it, but we'll still have to now look at under which conditions you even have to do that form of binding. Now, visual search, or actually more generally search, is a special combination of these operations. So in visual search, you have input that directly drives the boundary representation. For instance, you would have a little peek at these two locations because there's their 2D input. And what you want to do is select or search for an object that matches a certain expectation. And that expectation is an unbound representation. So let's say you are looking for a blue object. So you only know your search cue, or the thing that you know about the object, is just its unbound color. And then you want to find out where it is. So you want to find out its spatial location. And that means you actually can point to where in the scene that blue object is. You could reach there, for instance. And that will make use of the bound representation of blue to the location of blue. And so the way that works is that you try to bind the blue to the 2D representation by inducing here a ridge. And now you can arrange thresholds for the detection stability to be such that only where 2D input from the visual scene overlaps with that ridge, a peak is formed, and then you can project out that ridge, unbind its spatial location, right? And then you would have identified where the blue object is. That is essentially what the core of visual search is. And the proof of that is in Raoul Greben's model, which he will be presenting on Thursday in much more detail. So that's a little shortcut through that model. And I'll show you, and it's much more complex, that model. I'm showing some highlights. So in one variant that Raoul will present very briefly only, the system has three types of feature values. It will have color, it will have orientation, it will have some form of shape features. That's a template matching kind of feature. And you see here there are sort of more roundish things and more rectangular things, and these little squiggles are different shapes. And you might have a task to find, I don't know exactly what, find what was the object we were looking for here. I don't even recognize it. So it's one particular combination of these three feature values. I don't actually see it right now. Takes some time. Not sure what one's looking for in this particular example. So these features would be extracted in the usual way, and there would be a representation that that represents these features. So there's a three-dimensional field that represents all shapes over 2D visual space, all orientations, and all colors. And I will be talking in a moment about this fact that we will be looking at them as being represented by 3 separate fields, then rather than by one 5-dimensional field that combines retinal location XY with all 3 features. And so the mechanism of visual search, this is actually for the scene guidance part of it, but it's sort of analogous to visual search, would be that you have some cue. For instance, I'm looking for a particular shape. So I have a one-dimensional shape representation, a one-dimensional orientation representation, and maybe a one-dimensional color representation. And then you're looking for those features by inserting a slice. That would be the generalization to 2 dimensions of the ridge. Now will be a slice. So you activate all those combinations of X and Y where this given color is represented, and similar for orientation and shape. And then there is some magic that I'm not going to explain right now, how you combine these 3 cues to then select in the scene the object that actually matches on a given number of these individual feature dimensions. So it's the same core kind of idea. And here's another example of how to use this ridge logic. So for instance, if you want to look, once you have these 3-dimensional representations, if you want to look up what the feature values are for a particular object, all you have to do is activate a particular location. That will be sort of a column through these, a cylinder going through these different fields. And that would enable a peak only where that cylinder overlaps with any peak in that field. And then with any activation in that field. And this peak could then be read out by projecting again onto the one-dimensional space that just spans the feature dimension. So that projection would, the reverse of the slice, right? Everywhere in a particular layer, the activation is projected out onto the one-dimension feature representation then. So Raul will give you a survey over this kind of thing. Here is an example. He is actually looking for this object. It's actually driven by actual camera input. And one of the magic things is that this works autonomously, that peaks form. So currently, for instance, this is attending to this location where the change was induced because there's a transient detector in here. And in a certain moment, it will be selecting an object in the scene. I think it is actually selecting this one because it matches in color, is very salient. Isn't really the thing that's looked for. The thing is that, and there's some way of how that system corrects that mistake. So he will be talking a little bit about that and talking about how to connect that to categories. They were connecting to deep networks, very interesting other aspects. But this idea of searching in a representation by cue, by queuing a subset of the features represented, is a very general idea. So you could think of looking for instance, a certain kind of relational concept, for instance, or a verb by activating some properties of that verb, and then the right concept comes to mind, and you will be able to activate it. And we're not quite there yet, but Daniel will be providing the background for looking at that also on Thursday. So you may know that search is sort of a core feature of artificial intelligence kind of thinking. And there is no good neural theory of search, but this is the entry point. So, and I'll come back to this in the sequence generation model. When we're looking in a sequence, what to select next is, in some sense, a search. We're looking for the best candidate that would be activated next. Well, what should I say next? What would be my next thought? Well, in a way, it's a search in the space of possible thoughts. And of course, it happens purely in parallel. And there would be a lot of pre-activation. So I don't have to search from scratch at every moment in time. You could think of that being the very same kind of mechanism, that I'm pre-activating and providing an input, and then I'm giving that a boost, and the next thought comes up. That's how I'm speaking. That's why it doesn't make so much sense. Okay, so this is as much as I'm going to say about search. And I will come back to binding in a little while. Before I do that, I want to talk about coordinate transforms. You might initially be surprised that the coordinate transforms comes in here right next to search and binding. I think they're very different things. Well, you'll see in some abstract way, it's quite analogous. And in fact, the mathematics that we'll be looking at now, you will see, goes through a lot of what we will look at in higher cognition. In fact, you will see that relational thinking, verbs, transformations, actions, they can often be viewed as coordinate forms. You could think of it like a movement. You could think as a coordinate form because you're transforming like a representation of that's relative to some initial location than to something that's relative to a new location. So you're making a transform of some form. So if you do that, then the movement can be represented very simply. But first, let's start very simply. Let's say maybe the most elementary kind of coordinate form is about the visual array. So for instance, you look at an object and so that is in your visual array because it's on your retina. And let's maybe think that you're staring straight ahead. Then the object would be in a different location in your visual array if you change gaze, look into a different direction in the world by turning your head. But because your arm is connected to your body, for the arm, the important information is really where it's relative to your body. So invariant, independent of where you're gazing, you will always make the same movement with your hand. So if you have the object in your visual array, you should transform it into a representation that is centered on your body in order to extract, the commands of how to move your hand to the object. So that's one set of operation. I'll come back to that and look at that into more detail. Before I do that, I also want to point out that transforms play a role in many other steps. And so here, for instance, the very notion of movement parameter is actually analogous, because when you have different targets on the table, let's say, and you're saying, oh, I want to reach this kind of object, then the actual motor command that you have to generate to make your hand move depends on where you initially are. You could, so for instance, if you're in this location, this would be your movement extent, so the amplitude, and this from some arbitrary axis would be, let's say, your movement direction. If your hand was initially, like you're taking this hand, it would be a different movement direction, maybe different extent, right? So the translation of the same representation of a target in body coordinates to movement parameters depends on the initial position of the hand, just like the body representation of an object depends on your gaze angle. And so you could think of the generation of these movement parameters as a coordinate transform. You would be transforming the representation of the target object into a reference frame that is centered in the initial position of your hand. And there's actually some neural evidence for that being done. And there, maybe I'll come back to other examples later. And so let's use this example. This is from Sebastian Schneeganz's chapter in the DFT book. This has been a series of pictures there. And I'll use this workhorse example here to make the ideas concrete. So this is now really framed in terms of eye movements, not taking into account that the head also moves in actual reality. It's actually gaze, which is where you're looking in the world, and you're combining eye movements and head movements in a certain way. Actually, the eyes go ahead because the eyes are faster, and then the head follows. And when the head follows, the eye actually moves back in the socket so that your gaze remains invariant. So gaze is the relevant variable. But now just look at the eye in isolation. Then let's say you have this particular visual array. You're fixating this object. That would mean on your retina, maybe on your camera frame. If this is a robot, the object would be in the center, in the fovea of that retinal display. And if you're now shifting gaze and looking at the green object, then the retinal image changes, of course, to now have the screen object here in the center. So the retinal image is the same, but is different, but the visual array is of course the same. So when we say we want to represent the visual array in a body-centered reference frame, maybe even in a reference frame that is anchored in the world, we can't really distinguish between these two if we don't allow body movement, but in some cases we'll allow body movement. Then the task consists of saying, given any image like that, what is the representation in the world in which I rest, given that I know perhaps where I'm looking, or where my eye is in relative to the body or relative to the outer world. And so this would be the transformation from retinal to body space, and there is a parameter that it depends on, that would be your gaze angle. I'll argue in a moment that this is a transformation that is in some sense steered. And to give that meaning, let me first point out that a mapping from one space, like retinal space, to another space, body space, that's of course a very natural thing that neural networks do, right? They are mappings. No, input, output would be a very simple feed-forward neural network, where you would simply, map the retinal location by having cables that point to the right direction in the body space. What's special about this mapping is it is a flexible mapping. It's a steerable mapping. That is, you would have to have a cable from any retinal position to any body position, and for the different gaze angles that you could have. And then when you choose a particular gaze angle, then you would have to select a particular subset of these connections to be the ones that are currently active. And I would call that steering. You would be steering the transform. So it's actually a continuous set, or a very large set of possible transforms that are all among which you can select the relevant set for a given situation, and the steering dimension would be what controls that selection. And that's a very general idea that happens in a lot of different places. So for instance, it even happens in something like a kinematic transform. If you want to know how to transform a desired direction of movement of your hands in muscle space, you'll have to make a transform from this space to this high dimensional space. But that transform will depend on where you are in space. So, for instance, if I'm in this position, well, the muscles move in this direction. If I'm in this position, the same muscles move in that direction, right? So you have to steer that transformation by a parameter which can be also itself high dimensional, in order to summarize this ensemble of transformations that are possible. So in a very simple space example, this can be achieved by having a bound representation of one of those spaces, here the retinal space, let's say, and the steering dimension. So this will be a bound representation of retinal along this axis and gaze angle along that axis. So any location in this field represents a particular combination of retinal space and gaze angle. It turns out that there are neural populations in the brain that behave like that. For instance, in LIP, which is a parietal cortical area, they are called gain fields, because what happens there is that the tuning of neurons to retinal location is sort of amplified by gaze. So if your gaze is at the right direction, then they are large. They give you large firing rates. If you move your gaze away, they are small firing rates. Just like the difference between neurons, the tuning of neurons to space when the gaze is here versus there, it would be the tuning curve would be amplified when the gaze passes through, and that amplification is observed in some of those cells. That's why they're called gain fields, because it's sort of like an amplification. The gain of an amplifier would be increased for certain values of the gaze angle. So you have that combined, or we would call it bind representation of the steering and the original steering space and the original space. You could then project out from this bound combination to the other representation you want to have here, the body representation, and that systematic, who projects where, that will be just you figuring out what the transformation is, some formula that is encoded in the connectivities. Now I'll illustrate in a moment that we can guess the formula for this particular example. That's very general principle. So if you think of these more abstract representations ahead, then you would always have to have a bound representation of what changes the mapping in addition to the originator space of the mapping. And that bound representation then makes some connection to the third space. It will later turn out that you can go in both directions, and we'll look at that. So let's go through a few examples to guess what the map should be like. So let's say I have this situation. I'm looking straight ahead. There's a visual stimulus a little bit to the right. So gaze angle is 0. I'm calling this forward 0. Retinal angle is 10 to the right. And therefore, the body-centered representation is the same, right? It's this situation, the two coordinate systems are aligned. So I have here a peak at 10 in retinal coordinates, 0 gaze angle. They are bound together here in this representation. You see, this is an example where it really makes sense to think of this as binding, because the neural representation of gaze angle, there's some ways of how the brain actually keeps track of where the eye is. Yeah, in different substrate than the representation of the visual array, which is in the comes from the retinal stem, goes through visual cortex. They meet up in parietal cortex, and they are really combined there, bound together in these gain fields. So this would be the peak that represents this body location. Now, if I just shift the gaze, I'm looking right at the object, then the retinal location of the stimulus is 0. So I move this here to the left. The gaze angle is 10, so I move this up, and this is the peak I would get, but it's still the same relationship, same body-centered representation of 10 degrees. If I move the gaze further left, again, it's the same body representation, right? But now my gaze angle is negative, moved down here, and my retinal location is positive. This moved out on the retina. So I'm moving here to larger values, and you see I'm ending up here. And if you think through this, then you will find that there is a diagonal on which all the different combinations of gaze angle and retinal angle lie that lead to the same body representation. If you have a different body representation, if you move this around, then this will shift. This diagonal will lie at different locations along the other diagonal. So what you could do is you could marginalize this dimension. We want to get rid of one of the bound dimensions, marginalize along this line to project onto now a body-centered representation that where all these different locations are mapped onto the same plus 10 degrees value in the body-centered space. And again, if you think through this, if you marginalize along this axis, you will find the representation of any bodies that corresponds to a body-centered representation position, further to the right, and so on. And think through that. That's just using these concepts we just defined, right? So in many of the cases that we'll be thinking about these things, these couplings can be multi-directional. So you could have coupling that goes projection onto the body-centered frame, but you could also have the reverse projection and peak here, activating this whole diagonal, and also true for each one of those. So for instance, you could use this to say, if I know where something is relative to my body, for instance, I put out my hand and I have proprioceptive information where my hand is, then I can actually look at my hand. And that means I can compute the gaze angle at which I would fovealize that location. So I know the retinal location, I know this, and I can compute a desired gaze angle. Or I could know where something is, I could know where I'm looking, I could predict where this would show up on my retina. So it would be combining these two to that, and all possible combinations would be possible. So in this original work where we developed some of the math for this, we actually showed a special effect. So this is an example. We stop that somewhere here. So right here, so there are, sorry, oops, I wanted to click here on the stop button. So there are two objects on the retinal representation. This is our gaze angle, and you will now see how peaks are formed in a space-centered, body-centered representation. This is at gazing right ahead. So this and the retinal representation are isomorphic right here, and so the peaks are formed. And now what will happen is that we will turn off the inputs. So the retinal information is turned off, and this will be sustained. So we'll remember where it's in body coordinates. So now it's turned off. Already tell you that the red line here is actually the prediction where this is based on the body center frame. There is already a prediction in place now because these are in working memory in this particular gaze angle. And what will happen next is that there is an update of gaze. So gaze is shifted. See, now gaze shifts from this location to that location. There's a saccade. Oops, no, I clicked again on the wrong thing. So let's go to the same position. Here, there was this gaze shift, right? And so what will happen is that this will make a new prediction about where the object should show up on the retina. Hopefully this time this will work. Yeah, so it's predicting where these objects on the retina, they have shifted on the retina. And this accounts for phenomena that are observed. This is a famous story. This is from LIP, but there are other areas like IT areas that have effects like that. So for instance, there are some neurons that are tuned to particular retinal locations. This would be an example. This neuron that these recordings are from fires when some stimulus falls into its receptive field, this little dashed line. This would be the example of that neuron firing when the stimulus is on, and it actually has some form of sustained activation, not quite, it sort of slowly decays, but when you turn off the stimulus, it will keep firing. While if you move through saccadic movement, you move the receptive field away from this location, so the object actually stays on, stimulus stays on, but you move away, then it actually suppresses firing quite quickly. Now, the exciting thing is that you can actually show to this neuron some visual stimulus, like very briefly, but that's outside the receptive field of that neuron. But then you make a saccadic eye movement, and that eye movement brings the stimulus into the receptive field of the neuron. But by the time that the eye has arrived there, the stimulus is already gone. And you still find a pattern of activation in this neuron. It's the pattern of activation that is consistent with having actually moved the stimulus from your retina, from the visual array. So that's based on prediction, just as the kind we saw. And here at the bottom, you see how the model tries to account for that. There's some subtleties about that. So this is there's more work on that. It's not actually all our work. There's a person who most promoted these kind of ideas is called Pouget, who modeled a lot of different phenomena that can be accounted for similar works. The whole community looks at gain fields and so on. So this is just how we plug that kind of phenomenology into our framework, and we'll use it in a lot of different places to look at coordination forms. Of course, in reality, the dimensionality is a little bit different. In reality, I just plotted one dimension. Of course, retina has two dimensions, and gaze has two dimensions, and then the body center representation has two dimensions. So you really have a, when you have a bound representation of those, it's an 8-dimensional, it's a 4-dimensional field. One can illustrate this way by plotting along 2 dimensions, always small 2-dimensional representations of the other 2 dimensions. And it's that 4-dimensional field that then projects reciprocally to the 2-dimensional body center representation. But there's nothing qualitatively new, it's just more complicated. Okay, that was the coordinate transform kind of idea. And now I can go back, here's my roadmap. I can go back to the binding problem, and then actually point out how the binding in this anatomical sense doesn't really scale well, and we'll need a new version of binding. We call it binding through space, and I'll talk about that. And that leads me into thinking about localist versus distributed representations, ultimately think about learning. Now, so let's first think about scaling. So I took here an example and I engineered it to get the right number out of it. About some plausible features that you might be representing in your brain, right? So for visual information, we have a lot of knowledge about features that you can, for instance, commit to working memory. We know that you can represent, of course, the 2 spatial dimensions. You can represent depth. there's a neural support for that. There's a disparity map, and generally a stereo that, of course, empirically can be estimated. You could have this orientation I already talked about. You can represent color. You can represent texture, which is essentially like spatial frequency. So how fine a grid is, for instance, you can remember that. You can represent movement direction. You have some size feature, for instance, which is related to texture. You can sort of say how wide something was or how narrow. And I just took those because that's 8, but there are more. There are a couple more dimensions that we can name that have been studied. So 8 dimensions, and I just took that to make the numbers 9. So if we think that we need about 100 neurons to represent every dimension, just a talk, could be 50, could be 300. Then how many neurons do I need to represent all of these together, right? So jointly, in the sense, bound, right? They know which color, which orientation, which texture, which movement direction, and which location. That would be combining all of these. So I need a different axis for each of these. So I have then 8 axes like that, 100 neurons per axis. So that gives you 10 to the 16 neurons to sample that space, right? I mean, I just engineered the numbers because we know that that's more than there are neurons in the brain, but you can add more dimensions and say, I get away with only 10 neurons per dimension. Very quickly, you see this does not scale well, right? This is certainly a problem. So we can't really say that we're going to use these sorts of ideas in feature dimensions of arbitrary dimension. And 8 dimension doesn't even sound so much, right? If you think of some of the arguments people make about memorizing details of visual images, that will be a very high dimensional space. So that's where other kinds of representations that would be not localist would be needed to be invoked, and then you have problems that we'll be discussing. So this idea doesn't really work that way. So what's the answer to that? Well, there's a notion that goes back to Anne Treisman, and a lot of her collaborators, and it's been elaborated over the years, called feature integration theory. And there was some evidence for that I'm not going to review in detail. And the notion is that you could actually very well have separate representations for these different features, as already hinted in the allusion to Hall-Greben's model, but that they all share one dimension, actually, in this, technically speaking, two, so one kind of dimensional variable, and that would be visual space. So visual space being special would be, that's why they call it binding through space. The original model, and actually for a very long time in the literature, this notion was a verbal theory where they were actually using concretely information processing language of invoking a feature file. So you would file, like in a cabinet, you would file all the different values that pertain to an object into one folder, so that you would know who belongs to whom, and that folder would be associated with a spatial location. And our kind of modeling, which was done earlier, I mentioned the Hall-Greben model because I just reviewed it, but we used these kind of ideas in earlier models, included in the book. You see in the book chapter, I think it's chapter 9, or is it 8? We already discussed these ideas. I think chapter 6 and 8 refer to these ideas. So we would represent features separately, and then of course things scale differently, right? For instance, these 3 fields would be 3 times how many neurons you have here. So not this number times that number times that number, that leads to this enormous growth, but adding these numbers, right? And that will be then, if I need, for instance, 10,000 neurons for each block, then I have 30,000 rather than have 10,000 times 10,000 times 10,000, right? And so how does that work? So the idea is already, I hinted at that earlier, is that when you have that shared dimension, you can activate the corresponding locations in the different fields. So you know, for instance, that this size and that orientation, that color belong together, are bound because they all pertain to the same spatial location. So for instance, here you could specify the spatial location, read out that feature information projecting out of there. But you could also assemble the thing. So if I know, for instance, that this is the size, this is the orientation, and I mean by this slice here, and this is the color, and I know it's this location, then I can arrange for peaks to be built only where these two, the slice and the ridge, overlap, and then extract that location, for instance, for certain purposes. Here's an example that illustrates this pedagogically. Let's say if I have somewhat arbitrary here, I have these colored letters, and I have a color representation and a letter here. It's actually not continuous. It's some discrete feature space of shapes for the letters. And so when you're saying, which letter, what does the green letter say? Which letter is green? Then you would have two representations. So color over space, one-dimensional space, shape over space. These different dots are the different entries here into the scene. And so you would search for green, that would be visual search, Q that is the peak that overlaps. So green, read out that spatial location, and that by reciprocal coupling, then the spatial location of that green would excite everything in this representation. So this object here is matches green, and then you can read out what the letter is at that green location. And because everything is reciprocal, this location will immediately start to activate this whole ridge. And so in the end, what you will be having is a ridge standing here and green activated, a ridge standing here. Sorry, here, green activated and a ridge standing here as activated. Right? That will be sort of an illustration of how that happens. The original work that looks into these forms of sequential, so this has to be done sequentially, right? You would actually, I'll not illustrate that here. Let's do that here in this context. So the original idea comes from visual working memory, where you can memorize well visual objects in your array. There is a capacity limit. You can only really memorize up to about 4 objects. And it's important insight in the literature that goes back to famous paper by Luck and Vogel, that the capacity limit of working memory, which is only about 4 plus minus 1, that is a question of number of visual objects, or how many different locations you have feature bundles, and not the number of feature values. So here in this example, it's just 2 features, orientation and color, but you could have more features like texture and maybe some shape, and maybe you have a little movement and so on. And when you have 4 objects, they could vary along all these different feature dimensions, so that the number of feature-related bits of information would be much larger than 4. It could be 32, or how many features you have. But your working memory capacity is actually not sensitive to this number of features, it's sensitive to the number of objects, you could say, to the number of spatial locations. And there's a possible origin of that in this account for binding. So just to explain to you what the hypothesis is. Hypothesis is that if you commit a visual scene like that to memory, you're actually doing this one item at a time. Because what you're doing is you're selecting an item and extracting so when you select an item, the bound representations, like this is color and location, and this is orientation and location, are becoming activated. And now your hypothesis, you're extracting the feature value, extracting the feature value of, I don't know, diagonal, and here of red, and you're representing these in a separate field, and you're now rebinding that with location. And so this is a location information that is informed about where you're attending. And we'll see in a moment, this can be a different space. It can be, for instance, allocentric space, not retinal space. So you're providing that spatial information, have these bound, and then this would be just a different layer of that same network, which is working memory. So you can actually keep these peaks alive. You can think of that as a separate layer of the original, of this attentional representation. So, and then you would have to shift attention. and attend to the next object, and you would extract the feature values there, combine that with your spatial information, and then add that into your working memory. And I think I have a third one. No, I skipped that. So in the end, you would have transformed these three. And you see why do you have to do that sequentially? You already see there is the potential for misbinding, right? If you were to do this in one step, you wouldn't be able to know who is where. There are actually some subtle effects called illusory conjunctions where people are actually making such misbindings under conditions when, for instance, two objects are close to each other. There can be misbinding, something we modeled with these techniques. So work on this sort of paradigm was actually the original driver of feature integration theory, because then when people were looking at for what happens, what kind of mistakes can you make in working memory, and one of those would be misbindings, that you would say that I saw an object, that's a particular combination that you of feature values that where the feature values are switched across different objects. And these would be mistakes that could occur under some circumstance in architecture like that are special. And they are special in that sense that they reflect that the feature values are not originally bound, that they have to be bound by an active process. So this argument that misbindings could lead to a problem is the elaboration of what I said earlier, that this account for how binding actually happens is really the argument for processing one item at a time. Now, this also opens the way to do this in different coordinate frames. So, for instance, if I have a spatial transform, so I know this was on my retina, let's say, and this is in my body frame. So when I use the location I'm currently attending to insert that into this bound representation that I will commit to memory, then I can make a transform. So this will be allocentric space rather than retinal space. So for instance, if you look at your table and you remember where what is, so can blindly reach for it, then that is in table coordinates because you're looking around. So on your retina, it's actually not invariant at all. And so it would make sense to have working memory for the retinal location. And you do have memory for its location on the table. It's independent of where you're looking. So that's very attractive to have this way of making the coordinate transform, because it will mean you have to do the coordinate transform only once, namely for spatial location itself, not for all the feature values. So for instance, if you think of this original space, in this space, you're combining only the spatial representation to the spatial representation that depends on your gaze, and similarly for other transforms. If you were to transform the whole feature representation, you see that that would again double all the representations you have to have, because for every feature value, you would have to have here a entry into every combination of a feature value with space in order to map that to any combination feature value with the body. So although one can transform multiple retinal locations at the same time to multiple body center coordination, because of this binding, you don't want to do that. You want to actually transform one location at a time. But the advantage is that you don't actually have to transform the feature information. You just reassemble the feature information in the coordinate transformed space. So we think very generally that's what's happened, that all the time you're operating on representations that are no longer directly bound to the sensory surfaces. You can even use in mental operations locations in space that you assign something to. Saying, here is old-fashioned AI and here is new AI, and then can refer to these concepts by pointing at locations in space. So you would have bound, an abstract concept like old AI versus new AI to a spatial location that is somewhere here in the visual array or relative to my body. And it could essentially be a more abstract form of using this kind of principle. So that's how coordinate transforms are very, it can be combined with binding in an attractive way. Now, binding through space, again, there's good psychophysical evidence for that. There's a large literature that I'm not really doing justice here for that in the area of visual cognition, but it is possibly also a much more general concept, and we'll see a little bit of that in Daniel Sabinas's lecture, in that the principle of this form of binding is that there is some shared dimension. It was space in these examples, and there's good evidence that space is special in these examples, but it doesn't always have to be space. It could be also a categorical kind of dimension, which is not mathematically no longer a dimension. For instance, an ordinal dimension that you say, all of this happened on the first event, and all of this happened on the second event, and all of this happened on the third event. And in some cases, we are calling this an index, so there will be some assignment to a subpopulation that deals with object number 1, object number 2, object number 3, for instance. Sometimes it could also be something that has meaning by itself. We would call that a label. But, everything that pertains to, I don't know, to a particular kind of object would be bound together. So there is some work in connections, and you might know Romelhart McClelland is a model in which attributes are linked through connectivity that is often thought of as a distributed form of representation, but one could actually reinterpret that as just binding in the sense, and that would require the need to have a particular index, I mean a label, to say a duck is something that can swim, that can fly, that has feathers and a certain kind of beak and whatever it is. So not as a subsymbolic, activation vector, but as a set of different feature instantiations, all of which could be activated, could have their own dynamics, could be committed to working memory, and then they would be bound together by that label is a duck. So we'll see a little bit of that in Daniel's lecture, although we're still starting to really establish how general these ideas are. Good, and so I'm transitioning now to the. I'll give 2 examples at the end of this lecture. So what I'll finish now are these elements, and then I'll illustrate that in 2 examples. And so the last element is to think about how learning plays a role. And that's important because when we say that these bound and unbound states represent things that like concepts and things you commit to memory, we have to think about how would they emerge from a learning process. And there is so in a way learning is connected to neurodynamics in a way that is not categorically different from that of neural networks, and not by chance, because it's just a special case of neural networks. We're just postulating that neural networks have additional properties, not fewer properties, or it's not separate. And so the key constraint is what I already mentioned, that we are committed to what are called localist representations in the tradition of connectionism. That is, in the end, a particular concept, a particular meaning, feature meaning, and it's also a particular capacity to generate action, is always linked to a peak that is localized in pattern of activation is localized in some space. Ultimately, if you think of that space as spanned by neurons, it's localized in a neural network. So the local region establishes this state. And the reason why we do that is this principle of creating peaks, making them stable, enabling the instabilities, the peak creation and suppression and selection and so on, with these interaction kernels, and making these interaction kernels homogeneous enables us to span this continuum of different possible spaces, but at the cost of having a whole lot of neurons represent every possible value. So traditionally, when connections arose, people were not thinking like that. They thought of those things were called grandmother neuron accounts. That is the idea. If you remember your grandmother, there's one neuron in your brain that's responsible for your grandmother, and you have another neuron for some other famous person and so on. There will be a localist representation, and then the idea that scales very badly. So if you want to, because we know it's not just one neuron, we might need 100 for every little item. So if you think of how many different things you can think of, then the number of neurons needed for that will be huge. And whenever you think of one object, then only a tiny, tiny little subset of the neurons would be active. That would be not consistent with what we typically observe in the brain. So there I had the notion that we have distributed representations so that an object is represented by just some very complicated activation pattern through the brain, and the deep networks now invite people to think like that. I will come back to that issue at the end of tomorrow's lecture. I just want to point out now that this has consequences for learning. So some of you might know that Hopfield methods and networks can actually do attractors with distributed representations. There's some complex vectors of activation where every neuron is one entry into the vector. It's a different picture, right? These are not dimensions in the psychophysical sense, but just neurons as dimensions. And the Hopfield networks can actually make attractors around those just vectors. But they do that by tuning the connections, the couplings, to specifically keep active those entries into the vector, that were positive in this pattern, and others are inhibited. So it's a model of memory, of memorized patterns, and therefore it can only do a fixed set of patterns, those that you learn, that you memorized. And that makes that it's very hard in Hopfield network to actually create attractors. They're always there. These attractors are always there. It's just a question into which you're falling. And your operation is to set the initial condition, then you're falling into the next attractor. So they don't have these instabilities in the things that we're talking about. So that's important to keep in mind when I now talk about Hebbian learning, because Hebbian learning is, of course, invoked for how these Hopfield networks learn these attractors. So, so Hebbian learning is really just the notion that when there's particular projection in a neural network, so some cables connection from one neural network to another neuron, one neuron in network to another neuron, and both neurons fire, the neuron that provides the input and the neuron that is projected onto fire, then that connection strength is going to be strengthened. In a more refined picture, if you look at spiking neural networks, it will be also a question really of this detailed temporal order. So if the presynaptic neuron fires before the postsynaptic, you would strengthen that connection. If it's the other way around, you would weaken that connection because it wouldn't be really predictive. But here we're glossing over that because we're not looking at this time-resolved structure. Now, these kind of notions can be applied to neural fields just as well. And here is a dynamic form of the equation. So this would be the Joule-Hebbian mechanism. So if some location in a population of neurons U2 fires, so this would be in this layer, and some location X in neural population 1 fires, then you're going to update your weights to increase. And dynamically, you have to make the weights themselves state variables. So this would be what they would call a forgetting term. That is only when so the attractor of this learning dynamics is that W equals this Hebbian term. And so that's just using dynamic systems jargon to talk about the Hebbian learning rule. So these kinds of neural learning rules can be applied to fields, and in fields, they amount to learning projection patterns among the different fields. It's this actually does lead to localized representations. Self-organized feature maps are actually examples of these sort of ideas. And they are particularly important for learning the connection between an activation node and its featural expansion. So you can imagine that if you arrange that whenever this feature node is activated, there is a certain activation picture that would be by, for instance, getting examples where both this is activated and the feature representation is present, and vice versa. When this feature representation is present and that node is active, then you learn to strengthen these connections, and then as a result, it will be actually typically bidirectional. As a result, you could induce activation by activating the node, or you could activate the node by inducing activation of this field. So you would have learned that conceptual, the grounding of that concept through Hebbian learning. And that's something that we did in a couple of models and is not really posing any particular problem. So Hebbian learning has its place in dynamical field theory, given that we're thinking really about localized, so localistic pictures. So we're talking about peaks, and the learning comes from peaks. And so now what you know, it's not the interaction pattern, it's the forward projection among fields and inputs. It is not learning the kernel. So when you're trying to learn the kernel, you run into all kinds of problems, whether the kernels remain homogeneous and so on. So we're postulating that the kernels are what they are, and carefully approach learning the kernel. But then the forward projections can be learned. In the fields, however, there is a simpler form of learning that we do invoke sometimes. Let's say, so this form of Hebbian learning we do use under some circumstances. The simpler form of learning is the memory trace that we often invoke. It is not standard. It is not common in the neural network literature to look at it this way, even though there is a neural network equivalent that I'll point to in a moment. And it's a little simpler, actually. So the notion here is that whenever you have activation, a memory trace of that activation is laid down. So let's say here's an activation, a suprathreshold activation, a peak is formed, and then there would be a substrate, I'll talk about that in a moment, where whenever a peak is active here, and I mean a suprathreshold peak, you would build a memory trace in this separate field, and that memory trace would conversely also excite that field location. It's like the self-reinforcing of that field location. If this, you could do the same for an inhibitory field, so that that this is always activating, strengthening this activation, but this activation itself could project inhibitorily on something else. So the net effect of that will be to actually increase inhibition, which is called habituation in the learning literature. While if it's a field that has excitatory effects, it would be called sensitization, that it's easier to get the same activation pattern than before. I'll show you the math we use for that. So in the mathematical formulation, we have a field, and that has its accompanying memory trace, UMem. And so the field would provide sigmoidal input to the dynamics of this memory, which would be a very simple low-pass filter. So just a slower version of the original space, but it would be, this time scale would be, for instance, a factor of 10 or 50, slower than the time scale of the original field. And we would typically postulate that if there is no input here at all, then the dynamics is actually zero. That is, you don't forget actively inputs. See, if you just have this equation, you set that to zero and no inputs, then memory would decay, go to zero. And so we're postulating that the dynamics is actually sensitive to whether there's any peak at all in the field, the memory trace we're talking about. So for here is an example. This would be an activation field. The different inputs given at different moments in time, peaks form here. And what the memory trace is, it builds up activation whenever a peak is formed. So as this peak is formed, it builds up a peak, and that peak stays. And the only way of direct forgetting is if a peak is formed elsewhere and not here, then the memory trace here becomes activated and it becomes deactivated at these other locations. So some kind of competitive forgetting that's implicit here in the dynamics, that is, it's turned off when there is no peak anywhere. But if there's a peak, then it will be growing where the peak lies. And at other locations, x prime, where this is zero, it will be forgetting. It goes to zero. So it will be, with this, the memory trace reflects sort of the probability of where peaks were observed in recent history. It's something like a memory trace, a probability trace of having peaks. So that is a mechanism that we postulated, and we've used this mechanism to account for a lot of data. And in that sense, it is a theoretical concept that is well grounded in empirical research. It is not really as clear as in other cases what would be the neural mechanism for that. Now, there are actually mechanisms like that in conventional neural networks. These are the so-called bias units. So when you have a neural networks, some of you might know that, there's a lot of inputs from other neurons, and it's usually one variable that doesn't depend on input, that is just a entry into the sum that the neuron performs that's constant, it doesn't depend on input. And that term can actually be used in learning to adjust somehow to some kind of normalization. It's only sort of a homeostasis mechanism in practical neural networks. Doesn't do as much work as the actual synapses. It does a lot of work in DFT. Why does it do a lot of work in DFT? I already told you yesterday, because this would be a mechanism of how you can create small differences between different locations that will be a little bit boosted by that kind of bias input. And the memory trace as a sort of form of input. And so these kind of small differences can be amplified by the detection stability into real peaks. And so they do a lot of work that is not equivalently done in these conventional neural network models. Now, the neural mechanisms of that could be of multiple forms. We just write it this way, but because this is slower, this is not a membrane dynamics kind of timescale. It is ultimately a synaptic sort of chemical timescale, which would be at least a factor of 5 or 10 slower. It would be not 1,000 times slower. It would be still something that happens over a few incidents of creating a peak. And we say this empirically because we model different learning situations and saw that a single learning event creating a peak in the model already influences the probability of having a future event in the sense of habit formation or habituation, the two directions. So it's a synaptic mechanism, and there are multiple different proposals for how that could be actually implemented in the brain. So we just model it in this way with this separate dynamics, but this would be a synaptic dynamics. So the memory trace does extra work in our models because we can amplify it into a macroscopic peak, but there's some subtlety about that because it really has different property of how you can then reactivate a peak, for instance, that originally laid down that memory trace. It's really more appropriate to think of reactivation of a past pattern that was learned through the memory trace. And you can reactivate it even if the input that was originally present to create the peak is not present. And in Hebbian learning, you're only strengthening a projection. So it will only have an effect if the presynaptic neuron is active. So for instance, if you learn to drive neurons that do pattern recognition, they will only be effective, these connections, if there is that input of a pattern that is in the situation that you learned. When you recall something from memory, that's not the case, right? When you recall from memory, you might not get any information. You do free recall, just try to remember what you saw. Or you get a cue recall, you're saying, where was the red thing? Or which color did have the object at this location? And so you're getting only a partial cue for the previous input, and therefore synaptic projections in the forward system will not be effective for free or only have a limited effectiveness for cued recall. But with a memory trace, you're bringing the memory trace up to a peak by just boosting the system. So you can actually make use of your learned experience, even when that specific input path along which you strengthen the synaptic projections is not actually receiving any input. So it has a different functional role, and we're using it in this role a lot in our models. Some of you may know that the way long-term memories are formed from ongoing activation or working memory is actually not very clear. It's one of the least well-developed theories. There is some idea of hippocampal CA4 cells doing something like Hebbian learning in a Hopfield sense. It's not entirely clear. So this is a very simple macroscopic kind of description of how to build long-term memories and how to then recall or reactivate long-term memories. And I demonstrated that yesterday, right? When I had this tiny little pre-activations that could be the result of a memory trace, and then I boosted the system to generate a peak from that, right? That will be free recall. And with what you now know, you know if these memory traces were laid down in a high-dimensional field, and I could boost them by giving a ridge or slice input, then you could see that will be like a queue, where I'm saying not just any peak goes, but a peak that is consistent with this queue. And then the peak is induced. That will be a way of how I'm recalling from working memory a particular combination of features by just giving a subset of these feature values. And John Spencer will be using quite extensively this sort of technology to account for interesting effects in word learning. That's the memory trace. Okay, so that closes the methodological pictures. I've presented to you the new ideas that come from binding high-dimensional fields, binding through space, and then this, you know, how to think of how these connections emerge from learning. I wanted to take you through essentially two examples. It's written here as three of higher cognition, and some of this will be expanded tomorrow by Daniel Sabinas. No, Thursday. That just serves here to show you how, in which sense now you can do cognition with that. This was maybe still a little simple and maybe also abstract, and I can show you how you can do concretely higher cognition with that. So let me start by looking at perceptual grounding. So what's that? So here I'm talking about very simple kinds of relational concepts. There are concepts in two senses here. If I say, for instance, the red to the left of the green, I'm not actually talking about the object, I'm just saying red as a category. So this is a red concept. It's in language, right? A certain concept of redness. And so this will be a typical red thing, let's say. This will be a typical green object. So there are concepts in here in that red and green are concepts, but also in the sense of to the left of as a concept. So the red to the left of the green, of course, you know it is this thing. And when I'm saying that I'm grounding this relational phrase, then that means that I have somehow neurally represented this phrase. And we're not accounting for exactly how to do that with reading or speech perception, but we have extracted that phrase from some form of language processing. And now we're actually able to make sense of it in the sense that we're able to say where the red thing is that was mentioned here and where the green thing is that was mentioned here. Now, this phrase is very simple because here you could just pay attention to red and to green, and you wouldn't even have to pay attention to the phrase to the left of, although the more sophisticated thing that this architecture actually does is if the red was to the right of the green, it wouldn't activate the red. And that would show up here in the condition of dissatisfaction. So just to run this one more time, so you see that this architecture in some way actually does select the leftmost here among a target representation and the rightmost within a so-called reference configuration. And you can see perhaps here intuitively that it uses some kind of synaptic activation pattern that could be the neural implementation of the to the left of operator. And I'll try to illustrate a little bit how that works. I'll give you just the core story here, and tomorrow Daniel will round that again. He wants to cover a lot of ground, so he will also not go very deeply into these very simple cases, but then show how you can build further. So let me take you through how you could do this. And it's this architecture. We published this originally in 2017. There's a big journal paper out that was published actually just this year, or was it last year? I think 2021, with also Matthias Richter as the first author. This is the Matthias Richter who will be teaching on Thursday about neuromorphics. He did his PhD on this project, together with Jonas Linz, who also did his PhD on a related topic. So this looks like a very complex architecture. I'll take you through it very briefly, and you will see it's actually most of it is stuff that you already know. It's just combining these different components, starting with the most complicated. So there is something up here in which concepts are invoked. So this is these are nodes that represent a color concept of red. And they do that by virtue of their connection to a hue space field that has two components. I haven't explained the condition of satisfaction yet, and I will do that tomorrow. But the intention versus condition of satisfaction is two properties of each representation are about organizing sequences, and this thing works in sequence, and we'll talk tomorrow about how that works. So for now, ignore that difference, and you can perhaps intuit that, for instance, the yellow nodes are have their meaning because they are projecting onto the space to activate peaks near yellow, and conversely, if there's a peak at yellow, the yellow node is activated. And similar for the red node. So these would be simple color concepts. Now, the special thing that we have here is that we have multiple copies of the color nodes for different grammatical roles. The grammatical roles are here the roles of reference and target. So in a spatial relation, there is a reference and a target. The target will be the red here. You're talking about the object you ultimately want to attend to. And then the green is the reference that is to the left of, uses a reference object, the green object, to localize, to anchor the relation. And the red is the object that has that relation, and it's called a target. So you could say that there is a grammatical role. It's not exactly syntax, it's sort of a semantic grammatical role of objects as reference and as target. And so here is a first example of this trick of where I talked about binding dimensions. So we're now essentially saying that the concept nodes for red exist in, have a hidden dimension. They have a dimension of reference versus target, and there could be maybe a couple more roles. And that's actually shared with many other objects. So it could actually activate the whole reference column. And this is actually done when I'm talking about reference. All the neurons that stand for references objects will be boosted, and I will be selecting a reference object. Or if a later phase in the process I'm talking about a target, then all the target nodes will be boosted, and then I can activate one of those. So so you could say that these red yellow nodes share these dimensions of reference or target, and that allows me to use them in different contexts. And whenever, so that's an anatomical binding of role, the role, grammatical role of being a reference or target to the concept, right? I have different neurons, I mean, it's a small population of neurons for these different roles. So that's one new way of using concepts more flexibly. And you can see in later work that we're using more sophisticated roles. We're, for instance, also using ideas like that in action to talk about objects as objects that are used as a tool, or that are aimed, that the action is on, or that the action is to. This here is just a visual search machine that I showed previously. It's an intentional field, and this directly the field that's fed by the visual array. Here's the camera, the visual array that induces here these peaks. This is a color space field, and this in this particular architecture was actually movement space field, because this architecture can deal with movement relationships like to and away. So this third dimension is movement direction, which we computed in some way that I'm not explaining here. So these will be just two of these feature space cubes that we have, and you could have more than those. And so in here you can do visual search, right? If you're looking for a yellow object, you give a boost, a slice here, and that will create a peak where yellow is, and similarly for red and other things. So that's how you would be looking for objects in the visual array. And there is some, this here is again a set of concept nodes. Now these are relational concept nodes. Again, they're always two. That has to do with intention versus condition of satisfaction. Just like up here, there's also up here is this is again intention versus condition of satisfaction, while this is one role and that is the other role, right? So there are multiple copies. There's also here some sequential organization where you're first looking at reference and then a target. And that's something I'll explain tomorrow. So these are concept nodes, and these concept nodes are defined again by how they project onto, actually reciprocally, there's a projection onto some space, and that is actually these are spatial relations and spatial movement verbs. So this relates is the projection pattern onto the spatial representation. The spatial representation here is somewhere to the right. I will be explaining that in a moment. So this graph just illustrates the connection pattern, the way they project. Maybe very intuitive that the below node will be activated if in the spatial representation there is something below the center, somewhere here. So these would be positive synapses. And conversely, if the below is active, it will be giving a boost to locations here at the, in this region, here to the left, to the right, above. And see already it's centered in the center of this representation, right? So that will be the location where the reference object is. So we'll have to arrange that the spatial space on which this operates is centered on the reference object. You already see will involve a coordinate transform. And for the movement, this is away and this is toward. You can imagine that the direction of the movement is egocentric. So toward would be something that is where you're sitting on the object that the movement is about. So it's centered in the object, the reference object of this relative motion, moving toward a reference object or away from a reference object. Now here is the machinery of these coordinate transforms. This is a little bit complex and I'm not explaining all the details. So roughly speaking, you have two spatial fields. So one is the representation of possible target objects, and one is a representation of possible reference objects. So it's the same objects that enter into these different fields, and which field is currently being used is determined by a boost that comes either from the reference node or the target node, right? These two shared nodes. So when you're currently working on the reference, then this field will be boosted, and both of these fields get the same input from the visual array, but only this field will be able to make a peak. And then when you're attending to target, only this gets a boost, only this field will be able to make a peak, and that won't. And that's how you can control whether you're now creating a reference or a target object. So that's how you will be able to enter. For instance, here in this example, you will put the green, was it right? It was red to the left of green. Yeah, green would be the reference object. So I'm not sure this is actually right in this drawing. It should be somewhere on the right. Actually, maybe it's not that phrase that was granted yet. I don't remember. So the reference object will be activated here, and then it will be looking for the target object at some phase. Now, what this representation is it's a representation that is centered in the reference object. So this is actually the steering input to a coordinate transform, this here, that would transform the target field into a representation that is centered in the reference field. Again, this here is actually the reverse. You can also then take this reference-centered object, the reference field, and predict where the target is in the origin space. And there's this complication that for the movement verbs, it's a different representation. Movement is actually relative to, so you're sitting on the moving object and in a reference frame that is aligned with this motion. You do a rotation that is aligned with this movement, and then you're talking about the reference object along this line, with some deviation from this line to the left or to the right, and similar for the other side of the reference object. And I'm not explaining that in detail. So there are also coordinate transforms. They use log polar coordinates. You may realize log polar coordinates makes that along one axis, it's a rotation, and along the other axis, this is scaling of distance. So analogous, let's say. And so this is where the operator acts. So the operator, these kind of fields here are applied to this reference-centered representation. The magic is that this works even if you don't even have a peak yet. You can sort of simultaneously project all that, and then the right peak in the reference fields will emerge, for instance, that matches the right target object with the right relation. So you can do it all directions. You can get the target first and find the reference object, or you can get the reference first and find the target object. You can have reference and target object and find the relations. So you can do this in these three different ways. So all these projections are bidirectional, and we will actually sometimes use both. So this is a big topic to understand all of this. There is a paper about that, and Daniel will briefly review that in a different way tomorrow. Here is a simulation that I really like that demonstrates a lot of these ideas. So this is at one point we've worked with these screwdrivers. This system doesn't know anything about screwdrivers. It just knows about color. This is an early example where there was only one feature, was only color, to make it simple. It does visual search for just one feature. It's very simple. Now this is a very nice situation, because we have a phrase red to the left of green, right? This is the right answer. But there's another green in here, and it's actually larger because it's closer to the camera, so it will be more likely to be selected. And there is nothing to the left of it, and that's why this is an interesting case. So here is the illustration of how the phrase is represented. So there are different color nodes for reference. So green is activated to encode this phrase, and red is activated for the target object to refer that phrase. And I think this must be left. Yeah, this is the left that's activated. So that's how the language is encoded, just in these nodes. So we're not explaining how that comes from language processing. And what you will be seeing now is that the system will be selecting a potential reference. There are two possible references, the two greens. And there also, then later you will see it will represent the correct target, which would be the red objects, and it will have to select among those and pay attention perhaps to so the system is set up to reject hypothesis. It will make a wrong selection initially and reject it, and there's an inhibition of return not to make the same selection again. And the answer for the correct target will be represented here. And so this is a condition of satisfaction. I didn't really yet explain that. I will do that tomorrow, but you see a little bit the effect of the relation. So this left off has this sort of kernel, and in this layer of the spatial relation field, the reference object is here at the center. It hasn't been selected yet, so now it's overlaying multiple different things. And so whenever a target falls into the excited part of this, there will be a signal that says, I have found the object. And if it doesn't fall into that, in this version, we actually had a different neuron that has the inverted pattern that will then fire, and this will not fire. Now we think of that a little bit differently, but that worked at the time. So what you will see is that it will select this here as a reference object first, because it's a little larger, but it doesn't find any object for that, and therefore it actually inhibits this. It has already memorized it. It's not going to go back there. Inhibits this, and it's inhibited, and the next time it will be selecting this possible target here. And now for this target, it does actually find a suitable, here are the two possible objects, and we'll be finding the correct answer, this one here, and it's done, it has grounded this object here. So it does find the object, spatially attend to the object. That means it has grounded the phrase. Now it knows what that phrase refers to in the world. And I showed you this example because it does something like hypothesis testing, that is able to come up with a hypothesis and then dismiss the hypothesis and come up with another one. And how it sequentially organizes this. Now, it's all just one big integral differential equation running, right? So how does it do this sequence of steps? That's what I will be explaining tomorrow. So the last thing I want to do, so I already referred to Daniel many times, and you will be talking about that in detail. So the last thing I want to do, I'm already over time, is just to go to the extreme. And the extreme would be to remove the sensory input, right? So far, this architecture, yeah, it's some kind of higher cognition, but it still is about visual cognition. You get a visual array, and then in the visual array, you identify the object and could maybe reach for that object and point to that object. And so you could wonder, maybe it's still pretty much sensory motor embodied is that truly higher cognition? And now I want to push this one step further and say, well, we'll do what is called mental mapping, where there is no visual stimulus. And all you're doing is just thinking about things. And it's here based on phrases. We have this framework to represent phrases. So these phrases are from some text, which is quite confusing. The cyan object above the green object, and the red object is to the left of the green object. And I can't even remember this. And so if you get a couple of phrases like that, then you can build a mental map of those, and then you can answer queries like, where is the blue object related to the red object? So there's been some experimental work summarized here in this very good review paper by Markus Knauf and someone called Wagner, whose first name I just block on. And we're referring to some aspects of that work. It's actually already so high level that there's no very simple psychophysics. There's some qualitative insights that these people have summarized as rules of how you do that. And it's these qualitative insights that we modeled. This doesn't work so well when you really do it this way with such features as just colors. It's much easier to do this when it's categorical concepts. Like I think in one of the examples, it was cars parked in a parking lot, and it's like a Volkswagen versus a Porsche and things like that. It's also interesting that that's easier. And we can actually in the meantime do that too. But because we have these very simple feature representations, we did it just for color. This is the architecture that does that, and it is really similar to what you just saw. In fact, it is just a simplification, a subset of what we just did before. We threw out the movement stuff, so it only has the spatial relations. It has no visual input, right? So this is based on just mentally representing this, and there is actually a layer which would be present in the other model as well, but has effectively a different function because the visual input drives the scene. So there is a scene representation building here, which is in the current state actually just representing spatial locations of objects, but through a mechanism that you'll see in a moment, it actually knows what is where. And other than that, it's the same machinery. And now what we'll be doing is we'll be using the phrase and generating a neural representation that is a mental map based on that phrase. And so how does that work? The only thing that is really new is that what we'll be doing is when we're hearing the relations, so we know the reference. Well, actually, the first object we just put in the center of this field, and there's sort of this inhomogeneity that does that. And so once we have already a spatial scene and we know the feature values by representing that in this color stack of each of these objects, we will be now guiding the generation of a new peak by using the relation and the already existing map. And in that guidance, we will have different inputs to this here from the other object in the scene. And then actually that's where some psychophysical rule that we explained comes to play a role, that we'll find a free spot here where we put the object. So very naturally, the peak will emerge where inhibition from already pre-existing peaks are not, and that leads to the observation that you keep the relations intact that you already have in your map. So I'm not explaining this in the same level of detail, but too little time for that, but that's sort of the idea. So let me, in this illustration here, let's say if you're encoding this phrase and you already have from previous experiences this map. Now I'm labeled that these locations were generated by this mechanism in the map previously, and I put the labels there to know what colors there are, but the map itself doesn't have the colors. The colors are by looking up what is at that spatial location, going into spatial into the feature space scene memory, and then looking up what color is at that location, right? So that's how it actually works. But to illustrate it, I'm showing that here, and I'm sort of preparing you to see that the blue that is to the right of the red will be entered here, it will not be inserted between the green and the red, because a previous phrase was the green is to the right of the red, and this psychophysical rule is that you will keep that, you will not disturb that, you will put the blue to the right of that. That's what psychophysically people do. And the model does that too, because essentially this here creates a little bit of an inhibitory influence in the relational field, and that prevents a peak from squeezing in here, and so the peak will arise outside of that. So I'm not explaining all the details of how that works, but that's what you will be seeing emerging here from this. So all these different detection instabilities and so on happen, and so ultimately the blue is entered here. And you can query this. You can give it a phrase like, where is the blue relative to the green, which means you're assigning blue and green to reference and target roles, and can essentially now use this scene representation, but it's just based on what's just mentally built to answer that question. And you can imagine that you can apply the relational operators to the option. You bring them from scene memory. The scene memory was from your own mental image of the scene. And after the same kind of gymnastics that I'm not going to explain in detail, it will give the answer, which I think is to the right. Now, the blue relative to the green is to the right. Remember that we previously heard that the blue was to the right of the red. We were never given the information that the blue is to the right of the green. But testing that, that's how you test these subjects, that they put it in their mental map outside the map, so they don't squeeze it between. They will answer that it is to the right of the green, even though they could have put it to the left of the green originally. So I mentioned that because it is really the limit where we still do sensory motor internal representation, but it's no longer really linked to the sensory surface or the motor surface. Good. So I'm a little overdue here. As concluding that as we go to these fields over multiple different feature dimensions, we get these new cognitive functions, the different forms of binding. We are enabling search. We're looking at coordinate transforms that do a lot of work. You see the coordinate transforms show up here in this relational thinking. They will show up in mental sequences of operations. You can actually think of mental arithmetic as being coordinate transforms, because you have to anchor the new number representation on, if you do plus, you have to have a plus operator and you anchor it on one of the summands, right? You can imagine really sort of very analogous, all the way up to the mental mapping. So what is left is to understand how sequences come about. That's sort of very critical, because that's how we get any kind of complexity, and that I will be discussing tomorrow. So I close the lecture.